bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on, because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand. And nobody was really bothering to explain it to me. And I formed a bunch of opinions about the town and about the people in it that were like, surely that couldn't be. And then you find out later on the track that you are exactly on track.
All right, we got the first podcast, episode 1 of Ryan Research coming at you. This has been something in the works for a little while. I've been out of the media scene for a number of months now. I've been working on a few projects, getting things in order. But now I want to come back and get into some topics that are just, fascinating to me, stuff that really gets my mind going. Now, I made my bones talking about Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and I'm not going to do so much of that with this podcast. There will be touches, and in particular, this episode will cover central bank digital currency to some degree, and that's actually an area of focus that I'm going to explore more and more as I do more podcasts, videos, writing. But what I really want this podcast to be is an exploration of other ideas that I have, that I'm working on, and that encompass everything from, technology, business, economics, and going wider into history and politics, geopolitics, a lot of stuff, a lot of heady stuff. A lot of me just shouting into the void. That's what this is going to be. So, to get into it, I've been super interested in all discussion around central bank digital currency going on. From all that I can put together, it seems like COVID and all the lockdowns and all the online payments that are coming about because of it are inducing central banks, policymakers, everyone within that nexus to start really considering and pushing forward central bank digital currency, or CBDC. Now, how should we think about this? Is this good? Is it bad that they're rushing? From my perspective, it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal. The good thing is that it's actually getting talked about because all of the tech is pretty, simple. There's not much really needing to get done in terms of setting it up if you actually get smart developers in concert with the economists and government policymakers. So what's going on is you have everybody, IMF coming out, they're talking about a new Bretton Woods system. They go on to elaborate that there is a CBDC connection. Then you have places like the Bank of International Settlements coming out and doing white papers, doing exposés, doing everything to kind of document what is happening with central bank digital currencies. Now, this has all been suggested before, experiments, progress watching. If you really want the best detailed synopsis of what's going on in multiple central banks around the world, go to John Kiff's blog. If you can find him on Twitter, go to his website. He's got it all detailed out. But what we have here is a significant shift going from, maybe this is on the side, this is marginal, to, yeah, we're going to do this because everybody's online. This is the time to do it. We want to start playing with monetary policy in a couple different ways. And where I think the push really came from is that they want to do, forms of helicopter money per se. We saw a lot, let's say the United States, of now this direct depositing of just stimulus into people's bank accounts. And I think because that precedent was set, now we're moving on to say, hey, we can affect economic mass scale changes if we actually have a CBDC that we can sort of control, manipulate, inject, maybe not withdraw, but if you can actually get directly to the individual rather than you have to go through intermediaries, you have to go through the banking layer, and there's all these, clogs and bottlenecks that become of that. If you can get directly to the individual, then central bank digital currency seems like a really good option right now. So then again, what is central bank digital currency? Why is this important? Central bank digital currency is not cryptocurrency. It's not exactly, what we consider bank money or, obviously banknotes, coins. But the important thing to consider is while we have digital money already in banks, we do not have an actual equivalent to what you would hold in a wallet or your, purse, coins, banknotes. Those are direct relationships, even though it's very simple, it's very crude, that you have to your central bank. There's no intermediary. You don't have to interface. There's no third party that has to get between you and the central bank, in a sense, for you to exchange a transaction from point A to point B. Now, you're doing that from point A to point B, but the central bank is basically the other intermediary that's coming in and providing you the currency. Now, there's no way to replicate that currently with the setup right now. So if you actually get a CBDC in there, what starts to happen is you get that relationship back. You get that individual connection back to your central bank that theoretically we have a right to have that. We have a right to not use commercial banking for all our transactions. There was a time where people used cash for many of the transactions they did day to day. You did not have to actually interact per se with a commercial bank, a private bank, for your entire livelihood. Now we move forward in history and we get to the point where, we have the last estimate in about 2015, the Fed, a branch of it, I believe, I can't remember, one of them, St. Louis, maybe San Francisco, Kansas City, one of them. They were looking at what is the actual dynamic between physical cash, digital cash, online banking, all of this. How are actually people transferring money? And so when that came about, they saw that basically 9% or less is actually physical cash transactions in the total transaction volume. So let's just say for an individual, you pluck someone off the street, they are interacting with physical cash less than 10% of the time. They, more than 90% of the time, are probably using some form of digital transaction to go about their business. So we're already at this stage where we're using digital money. It's ubiquitous. There's really not a conceptual leap that we need to do in that realm. Conceptual leap we need to do is getting away from JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, all these other institutions that are sort of this private third layer in between you and your central bank. And so when you introduce the idea of central bank digital currencies, you get for the first time back to this conception of, well, we don't have to use the commercial banks. Well, we can if we want to for certain respects, but we can operate and have accounts at our own central bank as an individual, as a retail person. And when you open that door up, you suddenly start messing with delicate things that people don't want to disrupt. Now, overall, in the aggregate, is this better for the economy? My take on it is yes. What happens is you get a more accountable system where the central bank's never going to lose your money. They are the source of money creation. They will always print money to service whatever claim that you have on your account. In contrast, private banks do not have that ability. If they are insolvent, if they are illiquid, they cannot honor the claim, and you could be without money. So bringing that back, you don't have to worry about that if you have an actual Federal Reserve account from a retail perspective. The problem can arise when you have the idea of bank runs, when now people are flooding from private banks into central banks, and they're leaving the private banks that are the source of a lot of money creation, of credit facilities, not having the funds they need. So when that happens, things tighten up. And because we live in this world of fractional reserve banking, of bank money, central bank money, and there's a distinction there, because banks can create money, private banks. Suddenly, the first movers might be able to get to the central bank, but the last movers and everyone else, credit will freeze up, flows will freeze up, the private banks won't be able to honor all the contracts. Suddenly, flows will stop. Suddenly, money will disappear. We don't know where it went. It was fictitious in the first place to a certain degree. So at that point, the system kind of doesn't work. It's hard to make that transition. But a key insight, and I discovered this recently, from an economist, Joseph Huber, he's a guy in Germany. He, from what I can see, is the only one that's really suggesting this, is that you make equal convertibility from private bank money to central bank digital currency. You do that, you honor every claim that a private bank would have to a customer if they want to move over. Print the money, you give the customer the money. You stop any sort of individual, average person, average small business from getting into the position where suddenly everything's frozen. They can't move money around, flows stop. So that is a key insight to actually stop this, at least initial bank run crisis that can occur, that people really feel the central bank is the safest harbor for their cash. Now, that opens up a question of, well, shouldn't private banks be safe enough for people to think that they need to stick around there? And the obvious answer should be yeah, but a lot of people are skittish about that. And that's where, when you get into sort of the insider conversations regarding economists, central bankers, policymakers, anybody that's operating, writing documents, writing, all of these, what should happen, so much of the discussion is going out of its way to prevent this stuff, prevent that movement of people's money to central bank accounts, to make sure that intermediation function provided by banks stays in place, and that this bank run issue doesn't happen, because they're so scared that people don't actually like the private banking setup as it currently stands, and that any option that is as safe as a central bank, which can just print money to honor all claims that they have, will, that's the safest thing you can get. Now, what is actually the purpose of a bank? Is the purpose of a bank to hold money? Is the purpose of a bank to move payments around? You could say yes, and in a sense, that's correct, but ultimately, the core value proposition of a private bank, of a commercial bank, is to facilitate credit, to facilitate investment, and coordinate that. That is their job. That is where you really find that the central bank should stick to the issue of storing funds and moving funds around. Whereas, and by that I mean directed by the individual, whether that's a person, whether that's a business. They don't have any business deciding where the money goes in terms of investments and credit. That is the private banking sector's job. That is why ostensibly that they exist. And that should provide people enough incentive that they want to park their money with those private banks in order to get the return that they're getting from giving them funds to then facilitate credit. So suddenly, again, the begging of the question that goes on with the central bank digital currency discussion currently is that any attempt to issue directly to the retail customer is presented as this apocalyptic scenario where, private banking will cease to exist. Now, for certain practices that are going on currently, yes, maybe certain practices need to stop existing. But again, the actual activities that are a necessary function of any economy, the credit facilitation, will still happen, can still happen, will not be without. But ultimately, what has to happen is maybe they need to get a little bit more ethical, a little bit more secure with how they're going about their lending. How about they're going about their due diligence? How about they're giving, interest to their customers? And how people should start considering that a bank, just because of the natural progression of the economy that left the banks in this privileged position of, being in control of 90% of people's transaction volume and where people store all their money value that they have, that they have to go back to thinking of these are investment houses. These are where you park money, you expect an interest on it, you expect a return, and that is the expectation that should go in. Whereas, hey, I just want to store my money. I just want to use it to pay when I go to the grocery store, when I do this, when I get paid for my job. That can be what a central bank account is used for. And so once you stop the scare of bank runs, once you open up the discussion to say, what really is the job of the private banking sector and what should future expectations be, and disruption to encourage the ultimate aggregate good, which is initiating these central bank digital currencies, and in particular, the account-based model. Because another model is just, hey, we can do this, but we'll outsource it to the private banking sector, or maybe some technology companies that act as another intermediary layer between the private banks. And we're going to create all of these additional barriers between us and the actual individual business or customer person. Now that's a way you can go about it, and there's pluses and minuses to all of them. But it loses the sight of what can fundamentally happen when you have the momentum behind you to initiate these CBDCs, and you can put these accounts in place. You really get a shift of the paradigm where, like I said, you can make the economy safer. You can give people faith in that their money's not going to evaporate overnight. Now, you can worry about central bank and thus your government. That's a bigger fish to fry, I would say, than like your average private commercial bank. But at the same time, given that, you don't have to worry about, well, what are they loaning the money for, what purposes, what's happening, what's going on if there's a financial crisis, and then suddenly there's freezes and suddenly the economy's shutting down. By having these account-based models, you create a safety net that has a better chance of preventing that. Because not only are you creating a way where transactions can still go on, where value can still be stored and no one's actually losing out, but you're also placing regulation through sort of a competitive mechanism on the private banking sector to get better at lending, to actually increase the return that they might give to their customers, and maybe to think about, well, what is the natural rate that we should produce credit at? What should we actually be loaning to? Are our credit levels too high? Are we funding the wrong things? And so this can all bring about like a very elegant way to kind of rectify a lot of malformalities in the economy. And so moving on, I have an article where I explain this on ryanresearch.co. You can find it on there. Look for Central Bank Digital Currency, a provocation of a paradigm. You can get into the background of what's going on there, of a lot of what I'm explaining here. But again, what's important to focus on is that we currently have a system that's only set up in the past 100 years or so because of, lobbied interests, specialized carve-outs, but to a large degree, just sort of ignorance, neglect, and just sort of letting things fall where they may with how the digital technology developed, with how we just left where we move money around and things like that. And we have this chance to open up and, just bring some security, stability back to what we consider our money. Because our money is not what should be. Our money should not be what private banks produce or what private banks, kind of hold hostage sometimes the national economies too. And, there's some skepticism that can go on. And I'm aware of that in terms of, let's say, privacy. People come in and they talk about these privacy concerns, what's happening there. And, considering that percentage that we go back to, 90% of our transactions are already digital. It's probably higher for most people. Your bigger purchases are probably all digital. The 10% or so that you're actually doing is probably small denomination, inconsequential purchases that you're doing. Maybe some people a little bit different. Everyone's a little, there's a spectrum. People are on the margins. But all of the privacy concerns already exist today. So we're already at the status quo of our privacy is compromised because of how governments interact with private banks, how private banks use that for their own purposes. Our privacy is already up for grabs and it's already an ongoing debate. So we're already past the Rubicon there. So that shouldn't be such of a, whoa, what are we going to do here? We can't possibly go that route because, our privacy will be suspect. So we're already there. So then what the question is, it's like, okay, well, maybe a central bank or whatever other government organization that arises to fill this purpose knows more about our transaction history. Potentially. Do we really consider that is a such higher probability, that is such a more saturated way of going about our money system than what currently exists? I say no. I say we're already there. So it's really just moving horizontally. And at the same time, if you're so concerned about privacy, we can use this system that has the obvious limitations on privacy because of all of the pros that it gives us as we're using the system currently. The next step is, well, there's still cash, there's still banknotes, there's still coins. Those will still be in existence. As far as I'm concerned, most of the discussion has centered around keeping those. There's some about just getting rid of cash altogether because of certain things, that it's anonymous, it produces, a lubrication for crime and all this stuff. So there is a dialogue that talks about getting rid of it totally. Most people say no because of, it's inclusive to people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. We should consider that and allow that. At the same time, too, we have all these private cryptocurrencies that are rising. And if you are the type of person that is so concerned about privacy, you probably also believe in the power of these things to be censorship resistant and invade these government controls. So, there will be a utility there. There will be a service that you can use that will enable privacy for you when you need to use it. But as far as ubiquity of non-super privacy payment mechanisms, store of values, digital money systems that are currently in action, again, we're already there. So I don't think this privacy debate is really that substantial. I don't think it's that authentic. I think we can move forward. And so where I think we can go forward with central banking is that hopefully the discussion starts to get to where it's not just insiders, you get a bigger dialogue in legislatures, in media organizations that start getting input, feedback into the system to say, hey, we're not just gonna let this huge shift go unnoticed and just start to be avalanche down the hill. And before we know it, we can't stop it. I would hope that a lot of these notions of retail banking, of account models, of getting rid of such of a privileged role of private banks to be in this intermediary position. I would hope that that is very much considered, and that we move forward in a place that we don't get into the same financial crisis as we did in the past, where people as an individual can have a little bit more faith in their actual money. You don't have to get into this dynamic of bank runs, and we not necessarily have had a problem with that, but we've had a problem with this idea of the crisis of, 2008, the economy could freeze, it's interconnected, thus bailouts and recovery efforts, TARP, all this and that, to keep things moving. If we have account-based models of CBDCs, we can actually let private banks fall to the competitive forces of the market and still allow people to be totally secure with how they move money around, how payments are still there, and how the economy can still function on the actual grassroots level. So that's my shtick about CBDCs. It's a big thing. It's a global thing, societal thing, civilizational thing. And this is where I want to change course. I'm going to pivot part 2 for a little podcast discussion here. Is that this is where I'd like to get into more stuff that's interesting to me, that I'm reading, that's esoteric perhaps, that I think makes sense, is worth talking about, and how things go forward. Not everything will be super current or applicable to whatever the news cycle is. But if you're interested in ideas and formulating what we can take from the past and project it into new solutions for the future, this is my goal. This is what I want to do. And so this is where I want to turn to. We talked about big things. We talked about, like I said, civilizational things. There's a great guy named Arnold Toynbee. He was an old dude, English guy. Wrote a book called The Study of History. There's a couple volumes. I'm going to be focusing on basically the first half of those volumes, where he explores basically the origin of society, of civilization, nations, of how we start to consider, what are these things we're a part of? What are these aggregates? What are these groups? How do we think about these things starting and ending? And how does this interplay back into our current setup? We're in certainly a moment. We're in a moment, I would say. So what is Toynbee trying to do? He's trying to explain these things. And he is, like I said, let's say 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, he's coming out, he's writing these volumes. He's thinking about this stuff hard. He is trying to define what a society is. And that's where he thinks the unit of history is most important. And so he defines it as a society, we may say, is a product of the relations between individuals, and these relations of theirs arise from the coincidence of their individual fields of action. This coincidence combines the individual fields into a common ground, and this common ground is what we call a society. Little out there, little heady. But what he's getting at is this is the actual construct that we can look at, we can analyze, we can have sort of a cohesiveness. There's less blurriness. There certainly is blurriness, but there's less than other groups, tribes, clans that we can kind of think of. And so this is where he gets into a comparative study of civilizations. And for him, anywhere from 10 to 20 civilizations have existed. In terms of exactly their status, he defines some as still living. Obviously, Western civilization is a big deal for him. He goes on to explain how, the other big civilizations are the Islamic civilization, the Sinic civilization, or, Chinese, Asian, the Orthodox Russian civilization, and so forth and so forth. He gets into other forms, statuses of civilizations that are primitive, aborted, arrested, fossilized, or just like, they are currently no longer existent, but they can also be parents to the currently living civilizations. So this is how he's going about his study of history. This is how he's exploring these concepts. And what's important to think about is, what is his aim? What is his goal? Because as he's writing in the 1930s mainly, he's trying to figure out, what is happening. Like, we just had a World War I. There's war drums on the rise. There's certainly a lot of now industrialization and modernization going on to what previously was considered the other, the rest, to the West counterpart. And so now he's trying to make sense of this increased playing field of competition and trying to figure out, okay, we have the West, we have these other combative civilizations that we're dealing with. And he thinks that ultimately, which is funny because nationalism becomes such an important idea within the 20th century, he goes on to say, the purpose of this book, him focusing on civilizations, is largely due to with like this idea that nations are bad. Nations are imaginary, that nations are very messy, that are very weird for people to glom all of this allegiance to, and especially in a sense of history. And while this may sound like a very modern, like even 21st century take, he's, where he's coming from, very secular sounding. What's weird is he's actually coming to this opinion from the perspective of a very heavy duty Christian. What he's considering is that basically nationalism, nation states came about because of the Reformation. And as the Catholic Church lost precedence over the realms of Europe, nation states started to arise and people started to look at them, as he says, as idols. And so ever since, the Reformation happened, he just looks at this sort of, aberration, that the fact that we have these nations and that they play such heavy, distinct roles within the modern era and into his 20th century era. And so this is really what he's trying to do. He's trying to deconstruct nations. He's trying to, if not totally erase them, make them marginal and make it so that we're really focusing only on civilizations in terms of, as a historian and as someone that's dealing with international relations. Because this is the other half of his professional life. He's not only a historian, but he's working on current day international relations. And so he wants his work, his perspective, to then affect the people that are making policy decisions, the people that are conceptualizing how all our nation states currently need to interact. And perhaps there's a more cohesive strata that they can adhere to in his civilizational model in terms of themselves and who they see as their rivals. So as he goes further, he gets into what makes civilization. And he basically comes down to this idea of challenge and response. And that's the central concept that he has of, what is the stimulus that actually produces this distinct civilization? And so when you have primitive societies, he says they're not in a way just altogether qualitatively inferior, but they do not produce the same aspects of a higher level civilization. And so when you have these primitive societies being affected by certain stimulus like hard environments or migration to a new environment or certain pressures and invasions, war, anything that can kind of put the pressure cooker on them. That produces a term he puts as challenge and response, which allows them the opportunity to have creativity, to think of an innovation, push it forward, and actually rise to a new rung on the civilizational ladder. Maybe not to the degree of they're at that 100% ideal form of his civilization, but they're moving their way towards that. And as they interact more, they have more challenges, they respond more, they get to that level. And this is where he says ultimately the creative geniuses or the creative minorities of those primitive societies are the ones that will elicit that response. Those are the ones that are perceiving the challenge, that are thinking clearly enough to actually create something, whether that's a technology, that's a social construction, that's a new way of philosophy, whatever it might be. Those creative geniuses are what pushes society forward. And now, because he says they are a minority, it gets into this problem of, well, how are you actually getting civilization to push this through? You're talking about, individuals, if not a small grouping of individuals. This is where his concept of mimesis, and I might be pronouncing it wrong, FYI, mimesis, I'm going to go with mimesis, comes in. And this is where it reflects a convention where the creative minority is projecting whatever innovation they just did onto the mass public of their society. They're suggesting that you do this based on our persuasion of you, and that's what he suggests is hopefully the best outcome. But in reality, pragmatically, it can also be very much just pure rote copying, command and control. This minority is commanding the rest of them in some mechanism. Maybe that's more brutal, maybe that's more hierarchical and less, hammer and stick. That mimesis is done and that the entire population actually adheres to this new convention. And so when that happens, then you have this breakthrough, then you have the full response take place, and then you have the ability for the rest of that population to start producing creative minorities from other areas. Because now this idea is saturated through the population, and now they can use that idea to then leapfrog onto other ideas. And so this is how you get this churn of creativity going. And this is an important concept of how he talks about the churn of creativity. And he even uses a lot of calling back to the idea of yin and yang. And so, he's very much talking about the West, but he'll bring in concepts that are a little bit more alien or, what he would try to universalize like yin and yang, and try to put this in a perspective of, you need this back and forth, you need this cycle, you need this churning to keep going, to keep moving the civilization forward, to keep it alive. And so this is also reflective in his idea of withdrawal and return, which is this idea of that creative minority, creative genius. They are contemplating the problem, the challenge. They might step away from society to be an outsider. again, we're getting to yin and yang, and they come back in to be sort of this big leader, this inside leader to direct where society should go. And what I find really interesting here is as we start to get through these concepts about how civilizations form, how things happen, what's very important with the concepts I just mentioned is that there is this familiarness that he writes about to Friedrich Nietzsche. And the more that he goes into his ideas and starts talking about how he conceives of this process, the more you start to see somewhat of these reflections of Nietzsche. And Toynbee might not ultimately be a guy that is all about what Nietzsche was getting at, being that he's such of a hardcore Christian in a lot of senses. But we do know that Toynbee cites Nietzsche in the book in a certain place, not extensively, but we know for a fact that he's aware of Nietzsche. At the time that he was writing, he certainly would have been saturated through the popular literature. A lot of the other influences that Toynbee is pulling on, in particular, Henri Bergson, who is a French philosopher a little bit older, who pulls and influenced from Nietzsche a lot in terms of his creativity concepts. We know there's a through line there. We also know that while Toynbee isn't responding directly to Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, which is a very popular book that came out before this, a lot of same themes, a lot of same ideas, a little bit different. Spengler was coming from German and a continental philosophy to a certain degree, whereas, again, Toynbee is coming from an English liberal, empiricist sort of conception, again, kind of heavily Christian. What we can say about these influences that go back to Nietzsche, and the fact that we know that Toynbee is directly familiar with Nietzsche, that while he doesn't want to explicitly call him out in every instance, he seems to be responding to him in a big way, in that he is internalized a lot of what Nietzsche was getting at. And as a Christian, he is trying to make sense of a lot of those ideas. Namely, I think the death of God is pervading Toynbee's mind in a lot of ways, in terms of how do we conceive of the world? How should we, construct ourselves in a way to give meaning and give purpose and to have values? And I get this sense that he's an admirer of Nietzsche, but he's also in a way scared of him. But you cannot deny the sort of interplay of ideas where he's talking about creative geniuses, withdrawal and return, how civilizations form, this yin and yang churn, challenge and response. These are all Nietzschean ideas. And there's even times where Toynbee directly calls these creative geniuses supermen, superhumans. And, that is almost one for one going to Nietzsche's Übermensch. And when we put all these together, the finding is that Toynbee is coming to this place of Nietzsche's right about his conceptions. And I am now taking those conceptions, I'm putting them into sort of a narrative that constructs how civilizations come to be about and how do they fall, because that's where he gets into next. But ultimately, he's putting a purpose. He's putting a mission statement to some degree into civilizations. And by constructing this way, by putting the characters, the archetypes in the way that he does, he is basically constructing this off of the Nietzschean concepts. And that's what I think is important. That's what I think in a lot of the literature that surrounds Toynbee, that comments on him, doesn't exactly get into those comparisons. But I think that's very important. That is what Toynbee is dealing with. And that is what he's trying to make sense of. And that's why he's, trying to come from the Christian perspective and inform those concepts, which are in many ways undeniably true, but then respond in a way that kind of harkens back to which he's very informed by people like, say, St. Augustine of Hippo and the City of God, and going into that and the conceptions that are going into there. He's basically using that to inform his Christianity that then responds to Nietzsche. And so to go further from there, he talks about the breakdown next. And so basically civilizations break down because there's a failure of the creative minority to keep creating. They become a dominant minority. They are stagnant. They are without vitality. And so social unity is lost. Mimesis stops. They lose control of the physical and human environment. He has this thing about new wine in old bottles. And ultimately, there's just a complete catastrophe. So ultimately, why does creativity stop? He gets into talking about how the idolization of the ephemeral self, institutions, and techniques start to take place. So there's this fetishization. There's this also suicidal military nature of conquest. There's an intoxication of victory. And all basically coming down to the idea that you've gotten to a certain status and now you're resting on those achievements. You're trying to project kind of, again, a little bit horizontally, more so than creatively innovating vertically up the civilizational ladder. And so this is where he gets into an interesting point where he talks about the key things that happen during the breakdown. He suggests that a universal state will form. So this is sort of that projection horizontally, putting power, solidifying it in this universal state. You can compare this to the Roman Empire. You get a universal church as well. And also what's very important about this universal church, it becomes, not all the time, but in many ways, the seat of the eventual subsequent civilization that arises from it. That the growth will come from the universal church as sort of this creative springboard. So obviously within the Roman Empire, the universal church becomes Christianity. And as those develop, then you get into a period of troubles. Things are starting to go wrong. You get into interregnum, where things really go wrong, and you get into a Volkswanderung, great German word, where we can use the example of the Roman Empire again to kind of illustrate these things of Roman Empire's collapsing. There are periphery territories that are, creating their own warlords that lead them, that are not paying taxes back to the Roman HQ, that religions are getting more messy in terms of what is actually dynamic. And barbarians from the frontiers are coming in and they are, invading and they're taking over. And so this is where then he starts to talk about proletariat. And he makes this distinction between an internal and an external proletariat, not exactly in an economic sense, but in the sense that the internal proletariat are those that are any social element or group which is in some way inside the society, but not a part of it. And so what we consider that slaves or merchants or just people that are just not in the power structures, not in the elites for sure. And then there's the external proletariat, which goes back to those ideas of the barbarians, the people from the outside foreign territories that come in and see the weakness and invade and take over. And so when you have the period of troubles, when you have the interregnum, when you have the Volkswanderung, you have the internal proletariat corroded from the inside. You have the external proletariat destroying from the outside and coming in. And you have the society breakdown. So then what happens is, like I said, the universal church becomes this place where you can actually find meaning, and that this becomes where that internal proletariat most acutely takes up a lot of faith and residence And that produces the culture, that produces the springboard that allows for the next society to flourish. So that's where we move from the Roman society, or how Toynbee coins it. It's sort of this connection between the Hellenic, the Greek to Roman. They're one society, one civilization that then stops existing, becomes the parent to the West, to what we conceive as the West, to what he considers still alive today, or back in his day. And so ultimately, how do we keep going? We obviously need the creative geniuses to come back. So he talks about how, and this is where, you feel some of these Christian elements really come out more and more. The savior with the sword, the savior with the time machine, the philosopher masked by a king, and the religious savior. And so these saviors are creative geniuses that he suggests will come in the period of these like breakdowns that are a challenge, and they're responding to it. And it's not exactly clear if these are one for one within the primitive societies that he discusses at first. And there's there's criticism to be made of Toynbee, his arbitrariness, and how he tries to construct a narrative rather than something that's a little bit more systemic. But he suggests that the savior with the sword is obviously the creative genius that will try to use military might and power. Savior with the time machine will be someone that is sort of reaching back into the past for tradition that is anachronistic, or someone that is reaching for a future that is not apropos right now. Or there's the philosopher masked by a king, and this can take two forms of a king who gives power to philosophers, or a philosopher that becomes a king. If those fail, he suggests the king can go back to sort of the sword, and sort of there's a cycle here that can happen. But ultimately, these are all inconsequential. They might come to pass, but they actually don't produce the next society. That's where he gets in. The religious savior, the religious creative minority, will present themselves in a sense as a god, and these will be the people that actually push into the new society. Which again is sort of, as you go about his work, you find that Christian element really pop out, and in a way, it's a Christian take in response to Nietzsche, as I said earlier, that ultimately he's relying on the Christian Übermensch to be the savior of whatever breakdown is happening currently in the West. And so he responds to Nietzsche, Death of God, with the idea that we will recreate God in a Christian emulation that will propel our society forward. Now, he doesn't suggest that this will ultimately change the West, that this will kill the West off and we'll start something new. He has a perspective on civilization that is a little bit different, especially from Spengler, his sort of rival, contemporary, where Spengler suggests that civilizations are biological and that they have deaths, they have lifespans, where Toynbee agrees that a civilization can go out of existence. However, he suggests that with the creative churn that goes on, with sufficient creative responses to challenges that go on, you can have an infinite living civilization. And so this is where that if we really walk the line of the Übermensch, if we really rise above, we can create this infinite civilization in Toynbee's mind. And there can be, in a sense, sort of the creation of these, I might be going too far to suggest that he's saying like, we'll get to this sort of godlike form. I think that might be overstating it. I think most people don't exactly get that read. I think I picked up on that because of just how much colorful language he does use in referencing Christian concepts, metaphors, analogies, and weaving that into the Nietzschean, romantic sentiments that he's fueled with, and that is basically the narrative of how civilizations come to be and come to end, and how there's a recurrence. And so there's limitations here. I mean, there's obviously this arbitrariness where, why is that a civilization? Why is that? Why is that living? Why is that dead? Why are nations, befuddling, and why can we not consider something else to be the defining quality of a civilization? Now, he basically gets to the point where, yeah, civilizations are made up of politics, culture, and religion. Economics plays somewhat of a part. But once you start stripping him down, he really just lays on the board of, yeah, religion is what makes civilizations. Basically, like the central connection of religion is what puts all these things together. So that's why the West is basically this Christian, Western Christian society. Russia and the rest of the Slavic region is Orthodox. Now you can get, well, what about Protestants and Catholics? And doesn't that make sense? And what about different forms of Protestantism? Hey, what about America? Doesn't that make something a little bit harder to quantify? So there's all these criticisms you can make about how Toynbee is arbitrary, how you could find things that you can make groups about. And there's even more substantial things that you can make groups about, where you could suggest that in many ways in the past, religions represented power structures and affiliations to the state, and that, as many historians and anthropologists do, why don't you use language as the central connecting feature that goes from below to the upper echelons of society, that actually forms these more solid groups, these more solid societies. And that's where you can start seeing distinctions. Now, he doesn't do that. He gets into that. But he ultimately lays at the feet of religion being the central construction, because this is where he goes on. He finds like the current setup of his 1930s world of basically the West dominating culturally, politically, economically of basically every other place in the world. And ultimately, the reason why other civilizations are still alive and not just sort of fused into the West is because they have a different religious foundation, which then informs a culture that's a little bit different. And that's where you get the distinctions there. So that's where he's coming from. That's where, again, the Christian elements really can be highlighted here. That's what he's doing. Now, let's talk about a little bit of his influence, just to, again, kind of provide a little bit of like what is informing this actual work. And obviously, like, he is an English liberal. He is just from that milieu, John Locke. That is what is informing a lot of his base ideology, how he sees the world. This can be put at a little bit of a distinction from continental Europe, where there are other worldviews that were conflicting with that English Anglo-Lockean liberalism. But that is a first step to understanding, like, where is Toynbee coming from? Why is he disagreeing with Spengler? Why is he creating these concepts in a way? It helps understanding the Locke connection, I would say. It's not a firm, direct relationship, but it is the water that he swims in. Now, he then gets influenced by like Walter Bagehot, again, the creative transformation of civilization. Henri Bergson becomes a little bit more of a direct influence. He probably saw him lecture at some point as a young man. He was someone that was very pro-Catholic to some degree. And that's also then what starts to inform Toynbee in a weird way, that even though he's an English liberal and he's sort of a good English Protestant and maybe gets a little more secular, he then becomes very deferential to Catholicism. And then this is where you can start to see where his civilizational construct starts to form, that the Catholic Church becomes the West. And that ultimately, again, when the Reformation occurs, this is like an aberration, and that these nation states broke away from being a cohesive unit within the West or Catholic Church, and this sort of ecumenical universal nature of it. So that's where I would consider him getting this sort of revitalization of Christianity in a Catholic sense. And where he goes next, again, Oswald Spengler becomes not so much of an influence as like a rival and someone that he might be responding to at various points in the work. Spengler wrote Decline of the West basically as Toynbee already had a lot of these ideas in his head. And, Toynbee didn't need to read Spengler to then create his own, work on history. And where we come to next is that the two most direct influences on Toynbee becomes James Bryce, who is a lord, he's in government, he's a diplomat. He is ambassador to America. He writes reports on war crimes in World War I, and he then goes over to the Middle East to do similar things, and he takes Toynbee with him. And what James Bryce is doing is basically informing Toynbee's worldview on international relations, really. He's giving him concepts of this is how we're interacting currently. And so what Toynbee is doing, he's finding the confrontation with World War I of like nation states are the reason that we entered into it. And if only we could be the ecumenical West, then we wouldn't have to do that. And then as he gets into the Middle East, he's getting his first real life encounter with an alien civilization to his. And he's trying to conceptualize that. And ultimately, Bryce would take him to then write. Basically, Toynbee becomes one of the researchers that start to produce the Blue Book, which is the account of the Armenian genocide. And kind of funny how Toynbee just kind of pops in there and out. And then within that period too, as a young man, he's finding himself becoming less interested, which was his background within classics, within studying Greek and this and that. Also, connection back to Nietzsche, they were both interested in Greek classics. They both were well-versed, well understood in that subject matter. And this is where I think that affiliation is way more important because of that shared background. But moving on from there, he's a young man, he's moving away from ancient history, exactly, moving towards how he can deal with the current world, the current international playing field, how he can actually be a contemporary player. This is where Lionel Curtis comes in. Lionel Curtis is an intellectual. He is a founder of the Chatham House or the Royal Institute of International Studies. This is a sister affiliation to the Council for Relations in the United States. Notably, this becomes, to this day, a super prominent think tank NGO that produces academic work. It is a nexus point for scholars to come, policymakers, big wigs, all of those people to talk about things. So Curtis starts this up and invites him to be like director of studies and to have this position there, as he doesn't exactly have to rely on traditional academia. So Curtis becomes this mentor. It is also Curtis that gets Toynbee into being a researcher during the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And so Curtis becomes this longtime mentor that brings him into the prominent fray, that gives him a position of power and influence, and that is also engaging with him in sharing ideas. And if you look at the work that Curtis produces over his life, he starts to create a project through his writings and what he does as a practical intellectual to think about what the imperial West is and what the problems that are arising from colonialization, from post-colonialization, and where we go from here. And as Curtis goes down his road, he basically gets to the point of we need a world civilization, we need a world society. He suggests that it can be led by the West. He suggests also that there's sort of a secularization or harmonization of sort of the world culture, religions. We don't just politically ally, we come together and we unify totally. And so, there's a lot of trajectories that then go forward from there into what we can think about globalism and nationalism and where we are today. But as Lionel Curtis being this obvious mentor to Toynbee, and as Toynbee is sharing a lot of ideas back and forth, we see Toynbee go down the road in his development of conceptualizing where society needs to be, and ultimately his solution becomes that, and this doesn't take place exactly in his first volumes of the work that I'm most concentrating on, but as he goes into later volumes and later works and more, even lectures and discussions, he gets to the point of suggesting that, basically agreement with Curtis that there needs to be this creation of a universal world society of civilization. This is how we move forward. And now, from his perspective too, he might be pushed that direction, influenced by Curtis certainly, but he has a great fear of nuclear catastrophe. He becomes ardent in the position that the only way to stop nuclear catastrophe is that we have to have this unification, that we cannot have these boundaries, we cannot have these differences, or we will result in these weapons that are totally unforeseen to cause total destruction. So that informs where he goes. I consider also, as he's developing, he goes from an English liberal Protestant to someone that's a little bit more secular, to this sort of super traditional Catholic, as echoes today, in some way, to then what I consider kind of moving away from the Catholicism in a sense, but taking with it sort of that universal nature of it, that ecumenical sense that it produces, that we can have that concept and we can apply it to secular constructions, or even we can find a universal truth among all the cultures and religions and put that into the coherent kernel of the culture and society, that then we can produce all these overlays of economics, politics, and so forth from it. So that becomes one of the most important influences to Toynbee. This guy, Lionel Curtis, founder of Chatham House, major intellectual in contributing to ideas around world government, international relations, very important guy. And so this is where, this is the formation of Toynbee. This is how he comes about. I think it's also important to just reference to, he was kind of shunned by the historical profession, that because he was one guy, he was taking on such a large chunk of every single thing under the sun and field, which at his time was becoming super specialized. He rubbed shoulders the wrong way, and he was sort of a pariah within the profession. And then, even though he becomes immensely popular within, selling his books and being a public intellectual, he also eventually succumbs to a popular kind of marginalization that goes sort of coinciding with the internal discipline of historians as well. And he loses out because he becomes a little bit less Western chauvinistic in a sense. He wasn't so much so when he was writing in the 30s, but he really starts to kind of call out aggressive tendencies of the West, especially in regards to Russia and the other colonies around the world. And so that's basically what loses him out to popular, selling of books and being someone that's in the media. So that's Toynbee. So that is a study of history, his first volumes, concluding on the idea of why is he important? Why is this work substantial? It is because it informs a lot of how we consider things today. These ideas of the West, of the rest, of Chinese civilization, of Islamic civilization, of other civilizations we can start to consider, of Orthodox Russian. These things that are contemporary today that prove challenges, how we should think about them. This is sort of where it starts in a very formal way. You could argue this has always been around, that other people have made better contributions, but he is one of the pillars that start to create this modern conception of how we should think about things. This is also someone that pushes forward the idea that nations, nationalism, he comes from the Christian perspective on it, but it advances the idea that these are not something that we should progress to. These are something that are not in the lines of progress. And so this is then what helps fuel the emerging discussion around globalization, of what it means to be a nation, of what national means in terms of interacting with the rest of the world. So without Toynbee, we don't get such a formal construction of civilizations. Without Toynbee, we don't get such of a additive pressure to trajectories towards globalization and in making nations inferior. So that is what Toynbee brings to the table. First and foremost, I would suggest. And it is worth pointing out that many students of his, and I didn't mention this before, but his other professional outpost was at the London School of Economics, in addition to the Chatham House. Also relevant that at the time, Chatham House was a new invention. London School of Economics was a new invention. He was, again, sort of showing the fact that he was a marginal player within the orthodox historical profession, but he was kind of moving into these innovative fields with other innovative people that were forming new institutions, in a sense. And so a lot of his students from London School of Economics would go back to sort of their home nations or home, whatever landmass you want to call it at the time, and start to conceptualize these things and start to come towards ideations of nationalism, but also of pan-civilizational constructions. You get a lot of pan-Arabic talk, you get a lot of pan-Asian talk from students that were informed by him that then go back and become influential characters within their own milieus. So those are the important points to know about why Toynbee is a dude worth considering as a pillar of how we get to the 21st century, of how all these ideals swirling around are formed, and why you should give his book, A Study of History, a read to really be informed. So that is my synopsis, my little, CBDC, my little esoteric journey through the weirdness of Arnold Toynbee, and where I hope to go further. So if you like this, I hope you stick around for further. I hope you subscribe to whatever channel this might be. I hope you share it. Please do if you find some stuff that's kind of interesting. If you have any comments you want to provide me with, if you think I'm stupid, if you think I didn't know what I'm talking about with central banking, if you think I don't know what I'm talking about with history, with Arnold Toynbee, just comment on Twitter, shoot me a little message, how we can have this debate. I'm all for it. I want to have that. If there's any other good books or things, ideas that you think I maybe would be advantaged to check out, please send that to me. I would love that. But yeah, this goes forward to what I want to do with this podcast, where I'm going with other writing that I'll do that you can find on ryanresearch.co. I hope to really explore a lot of different ideas and maybe venture back into some familiar places like cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin once in a blue moon. So everybody, thanks for sticking around to the end.